Hello and welcome to the radiotimes.com Doctor Who podcast. My name's Huw Fullerton.
My name's Morgan Jeffrey.
And this week we're wishing you all a very happy Father's Day because we're revisiting the 2005 episode, which has that title. Because we tie into anniversaries, we tie into news stories, but we can also tie into, I don't know, what would you call Father's Day? Is it a holiday?
I think our US listeners, of which I'm sure there are many, would call it a holiday.
Yeah, so there you go. Is Father's Day the same in the US, or is it a different day?
No, I think it's a different day, so that analogy doesn't work at all. But never mind.
Yeah. But if it is the same day, you guys are going to love it. Obviously we're a few days ahead of Father's Day, but yeah, no, we just thought we were thinking of looking at the Parting of the Ways, just because that aired around this time about 15 years ago. But then we thought, you know what? Let's go a little bit left field. Let's look at Father's Day. And you know what? I'm glad we did, because I hadn't watched it in a while, and I rewatched it for this. And actually, it's very emotional, isn't it? It's a very emotional episode. I think probably I found it more emotional now than I did watching it at the time. Because I remember at the time, the first thing that always pops into my head with that episode is, and this is a bit of a brand name drop, this was way before I worked at the Radio Times, but I remember the Radio Times review complaining about this episode, the print review, because basically I think the Reapers, turning up as like a new part of canon, and the thing where the Doctor was able to take Rose literally to the moment of her father's death, no worries, when previously, and I think this is like a direct quote, he couldn't have made the TARDIS cross the road if he wanted to. So yeah, but the thing is, I think it's one of those things where, like, you can argue about, I mean, this was, the first series of the reboot, so you can kind of get away with not being super, super strict with the canon, but also I think it's such a good emotional through line and emotional story that you kind of forgive it those little things. And to be honest, like, watching it back, I'm like, yeah, the TARDIS kind of works when we want it to, and it doesn't work when we don't want it to. And
this is it. It's all plot dependent, right? And Doctor Who's rules of time travel, for example, have never been all that coherent or consistent. And what is or what isn't a fixed point in time tends to be entirely dependent on the demands of the story. But the important thing is that the Doctor knows the difference. So, because there's a line in Fires of Pompeii where he's talking to Donna about fixed points in time, and he says it's the burden of a Time Lord. I can see what is and isn't fixed, what can change, what can't change. It's just rather convenient that for the most part these fixed points in time tend to fall within Earth's history that we're already familiar with.
Yeah, it's not a fixed point in time that, like, a snail just goes along the surface of some distant planet. It's like always really important, difficult moral dilemmas.
Although to be fair to Doctor Who as well, Waters of Mars does have a fixed point in time that takes place in the year like 2059. So occasionally it does happen. That's
true. I think Waters of Mars sort of suggests that that's a fixed point in time because it's important as well. Whereas I think sometimes it's a bit vague. Sometimes it's like, it's a very clear, this happened, so this happened, so this happened. So it would be a huge change of history. Whereas with this, Rose says, well, he's just an ordinary guy, what would it matter? And the Doctor says, like, no, but it's super important, actually. That it's even more important that he's ordinary. So it does seem a bit random. It's fun watching it, though, like, because I think this was kind of part of Russell T Davies's big project with Doctor Who, is kind of bringing it to, a kind of layman, I suppose, and sort of saying, what would you do with time travel? What would you want to do? And obviously, seeing your parents when they were younger would be a thing for a lot of people. Like, that's literally what inspired Back to the Future, was someone wondering if he would have hung out with his dad, when they were younger. And with this, it kind of has this extra emotional weight because Rose's father dies. And, we'd noticed that Rose didn't have a dad maybe before this, but it wasn't like a big thing. And then, it just turns into this sort of very emotional story. Although watching it back, I was very aware of, it must have been a cheap one.
I think it was. I think it was one of the ones they intended to be a cheap episode to allow for the fireworks elsewhere in the series.
Yeah, like, it doesn't really matter, but it's like, I love that it's part of the story that there's not a very big cast. It's like, oh, where is everybody in this church? Oh, they all got eaten. Oh no, off screen.
But going back to the emotion of it, I think you're right in that. I think not only is Father's Day a great episode, but it's also the episode you would show to people to explain how Russell T Davies changed Doctor Who for a modern audience. I think it's the sort of best and purest example of that. I know it was written by Paul Cornell, but the crux of the original idea, I think, was Russell T Davies, and it was one of the first ideas, as you say, he came up with when he was planning that first series. And I think there's this like cliched idea that classic Doctor Who is dry and emotionless science fiction for boys, and then revived Doctor Who, at least under Russell T Davies, is this more soapy version of the show. That was the word that used to get thrown around, that appealed to a wider audience. I don't think that's especially true or fair entirely on either version of the show. I think they're both more nuanced than that. But I think it's probably fair to say that classic Doctor Who is more plot-led generally, and the new series is more character-led. And this episode in particular is a character piece rather than a plot piece, as we already said. You know, not all of the kind of the dots join up in terms of the plot and the story logic, but it's the performances and the character interactions and those dynamics that pull you through.
Definitely. To be fair as well, like one thing I do quite like about it is that speaking of, the story or whatever, I love how it kind of gives you this false out, where the Doctor's going to use some sci-fi nonsense to get everyone out of it and they're just got to hang out there. And then actually that doesn't work. And it's up to Rose's dad essentially to save the day and finally like help out. And I think that it's really nicely seeded throughout the episode. The Chekhov's car, essentially, that's sort of in the background, constantly almost running P over. And I don't know, like, because there's some parts of this, like we said, which are very like mainstream, very kind of accessible, but some bits of it, like it's quite dark episode, and it's quite an interesting one. Like that visual of the car that just keeps on coming around, like ready to kill him. Like it's easy to understand, but also I think it is quite an unusual image. Although recently online, people were looking at, there's a similar bit in I think it's in the Rings of Akatan or one of those. No, I can't remember which one it is. I think it's in Rings of Akatan, or it's in Bells of St. John, which is where Clara's dad almost gets hit by a car because a leaf goes in his face, and then Clara's mum saves him. And everyone online was like, "It's the same car, look!" And they found these two shots. They're like, "Who is this? Why is he trying to kill the parents of Doctor Who companions?" And I actually, through journalistic rigor, checked. And they are completely different cars. They're a similar colour.
Disappointing.
They're a completely different make. The one picture someone had taken made it look more like the other car.
I would love it if that was a story arc that had been running from 2005 to now, was finally going to pay off in Series 13.
Well, I mean, not to throw in the obligatory mention too early, but that's definitely a Big Finish short trip, isn't it? The car that's hunting Doctor Who companion parents just to kind of take them out of commission. Speaking of that, though, one thing that did strike me watching this is you do kind of notice a trend. There aren't a lot of present fathers in modern Doctor Who companions, are there? I mean, throughout the whole thing, because obviously Rose doesn't have Pete. Martha's mum and dad are divorced, and her dad doesn't really factor into it too much. Donna's dad obviously wasn't around, not because of a story thing, but because the actor Howard Atfield very sadly passed away. And then, Amy's dad was zapped out of existence. Clara's dad was around, wasn't he, actually, to be fair, but you never really meet him. I think you meet him once as an adult. I'm just running through them now. Bill was an orphan, and the new lot, Yaz does have a dad, to be fair, but Ryan's dad has like run out on him, essentially. So
I wonder,
it's interesting.
I wonder if it's a purposeful thing, this idea of absent fathers, because the Doctor, to some extent, fulfills that role in being the kind of mentor father figure. So it might seem strange if the companion already has that person in their life. If they have a strong relationship with their father, the Doctor can't fill that void for them.
Totally, that's exactly what I was going to say. Like, especially with I think the Christopher Eccleston Doctor and the Peter Capaldi Doctor, I think there's definitely that vibe, 100%. I mean, it's interesting that it's such a trend. I guess, to be honest, it probably helps if the companions are a little bit adrift, like for them to kind of want to come and travel with the Doctor anyway.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, because although it was seen as an innovation of the new series, this idea of companions being surrounded by family and friends and fleshing out those characters, you're right, there does need to be some seeds of dissatisfaction being sown within their personal lives in order for them to leave those lives behind and travel with the Doctor. So they can't have these fully functioning blissful family units, because they need to have something behind that's not quite clicking, that they leave to travel with the Doctor.
Yeah, it was one of the things people had with Yaz, actually, wasn't it? Is that she does have she doesn't get on with them necessarily, but she does have a pretty, nice family and quite a good job and stuff. So like, what's her secret? What's her dark secret? And then they did give her one. So
I think she's investigating sightings of a car that keeps trying to run her dad down. That's why she's traveling in the TARDIS to work all that out.
Coming soon to Big Finish. We love stories. But yeah, no, it's interesting. I mean, the thing with obviously with Pete is I don't know whether it was intended for Pete to become such an important character later on as well, but this isn't the last we see of him. It's not the last Rose sees of him, because we go to Pete's world. I mean, maybe that's why Pete had to die, because otherwise he would have founded a big soft drinks company, and accidentally brought about the rise of the Cybermen in our universe.
Nice.
So there's a little fan theory for you, but no, it is kind of interesting. The thing is, I like when Pete turns up later. Like, I think it is, again, it's the best version of the parallel world story, isn't it? The one where like someone who should be dead is alive. They do it a couple of times now, but I do think this episode definitely is the most like powerful version of that story.
Yeah, and as much as I like Shaun Dingwall as Pete, I think he's great. I do feel like the introduction of the alt Pete does take away a little something from the power of the original Pete's sacrifice.
Yeah. It's a little like Rose getting to keep her spare doctor in.
Yeah.
What's the episode? Journey's End.
Yeah, I think maybe like the Reapers, Pete should have stayed a powerful one-off.
Yeah, the Reapers haven't come back much, have they? Whenever there's been trouble with time and paradoxes, there's a paradox machine in series 3. No sign of the Reapers.
No, they appear to repair breaks in space and time, but only this once.
Yeah,
this once. Though presumably you could assume that once the Time Lords are back on the scene, they're then patrolling the time stream and preventing the return of the Reapers. Although now the Master has wiped the Time Lords out again, maybe the Reapers will make a return. Maybe they'll be the big bad in series 13. I think
all the big Reaper fans.
I actually, looking back, I actually think they have a lot of potential. I think they're interesting in the sense that they're not really villains. They're motivated by pure instinct.
Well, they're like antibodies. The Doctor says. Like exactly. They're just like blood cells, kind of like trying to repair an infection, essentially.
Yeah, and to quote Terminator, they can't be bargained with, they can't be reasoned with. They're just this unstoppable force. And like you say, they're almost sort of the good guys in this, because Rose has made this big mistake, and they're looking to fix this break in time.
What do you think about Rose's mistake, actually? Because one of the things that sort of struck me rewatching it is you do sympathise with her, and it's good, but also there is an extent to which it's obviously a monumentally stupid thing that she does. I think one of the things that is impressive about the episode and Billie Piper's performance is how well she sells it. Do you know what I mean? Like, you kind of do feel for her, to the extent that the Doctor apologises to her later on for being so mean. It's like, no, she has more or less ended the world, to be fair.
Yeah, I always felt as well, especially at the time, it irked me slightly. I felt it was quite hypocritical of the Doctor, given that he had booted Adam off of the TARDIS just one episode before for making one single mistake. And he was like, I only travel with the best. I've got Rose. And then one episode later, she makes a far more catastrophic mistake. She almost ends time and space as we know it. I suppose the difference is, now looking back on it, that what Adam did was self-serving and motivated purely by greed, whereas what Rose did was out of compassion. So it's more sympathetic.
It's a little self-serving. It is more about having her dad back than anything else.
Yeah, it is, but I guess that's a more understandable motive for making that mistake than Adam, who just wanted to make himself better. I think they're both big mistakes, but I think Rose's mistake is more understandable. Or maybe the Doctor just decided it was acceptable in the 80s.
Hey, I love that.
There you go.
No, I do think as well, though, there's something fun there in that, we've said before, like, I think the show does sometimes show the Doctor being a bit of a hypocrite. Like when Peter Capaldi's Doctor says, "Oh, we never, must never use violence. You've got to rise above it," and then he immediately punches someone like a scene later. Which kind of, I think that's one of the best examples of the show really making it clear, because I think people do sometimes take what he says as read.
Yeah, the Doctor's attitude to violence is about as consistent as the show's rules of time travel. Yeah, and whether or not the TARDIS works effectively. One moment the Doctor is sort of like a failing or failed pacifist. He's constantly preaching understanding and tolerance, but then that's not very dramatically interesting. So at some point he has to blow some stuff up. Yeah.
And I think the thing with this is we can read it as like the rules are different for Rose than for Adam, because the Doctor likes Rose. Do you know what I mean? Like, they do Sorry.
He was just looking for an excuse to boot Adam at the TARDIS. Let's be honest.
He was like, "Oh, you've touched that dial. That's really bad. You're so evil. Go,
Yeah, he
go."
didn't want him around in the first place. Let's be
No.
honest.
And I think there's a really great bit in this episode where obviously there's a running joke in this series in particular about the Doctor and Rose being, if they were boyfriend and girlfriend, kind of from different people.
Which makes the father figure analogy we brought up earlier slightly odd. But anyway, carry on.
Acceptable in the noughties. But yeah, no, basically, I do think that this is probably, in some ways, them at their most coupley in sort of the fight they have is very much like he's like, "Oh, I'm just going to go there. I'm just going to leave." And she's like, "Yeah, you won't because you're so lonely. You're so lonely without me. Yeah, you'll just go and mope around outside the TARDIS waiting for me to come back like you always do." Do you know what I mean? And then she's like, "You just don't like it. You're not the most important man in my life anymore." All that stuff. And the thing is, it's quite mean, but also it does sort of ring quite authentic in terms of like, I sort of had forgotten, like, Rose is quite mean to him there. Like, she really picks up on, like, what is presumably a bit of an insecurity, but also, like, it makes it feel like a real, I don't say relationship as a romantic relationship, but it makes it feel like a real kind of friendship and relationship in that they know how to hurt each other's feelings. It's not just the Doctor being unkind to us. We don't see that often the companions being unkind to the Doctor, apart from saying, "You've gone too far this time, Doctor."
Yeah, no, you're right. They don't tend to pick on his insecurities in that way. I think that's the fact that they know each other so well speaks to that closeness that the Doctor and Rose have, which is definitely, at this point at least, bordering on, if not fully blown romantic.
Definitely. I think the thing as well with this episode, which by the way, if you are thinking, "Oh, this would be a fun thing to watch with my dad for Father's Day," I might suggest reconsidering because it does show him dying for the greater good. I do think it's one of the things I've been thinking about recently with Doctor Who episodes is how many episodes just throw away, kind of ideas. Like there's like the bit with the couple who are getting married, where the Doctor's like, "Oh, you're ordinary people. I've never had a life like that. I'm definitely going to save you." That's like a tiny moment in the episode. It doesn't really relate to anything, but it in another story that could have been like the whole point. Is, oh, the Doctor wants to be ordinary. The Doctor wants to save ordinary people. It's thrown away here. The bit with the phone where it keeps playing, "Watson, come quickly. I need you." Like that's a cool little sci-fi moment. It doesn't actually really relate to the plot at all. It's just thrown in there. Obviously, the Reapers, and I think that young Mickey, which is a fun one. I do feel like it's a good example of kind of what Doctor Who does best, which is like, it must be galling sometimes to come up with a cool little sci-fi idea and be like, "Oh, what a cool thing this could be," and be like, "Well, I'm going to just throw away in half a scene of a Doctor Who episode and it might get cut." But I think that's what makes the episodes so good. They're so dense.
Yeah. That's the thing. Doctor Who specializes in this kind of dense storytelling. It blows through ideas at a rate of knots at a speed that no other show can really compete with, I think. And Stephen Moffat has said, hasn't he, before, that you've got a really good idea for a Doctor Who episode when you think, "Oh well, I've just blown that feature film idea."
Yeah, totally.
And you're right. And that's not something that's unique to Father's Day. That idea that like any one of these smaller ideas in another show could be expanded out into a full episode story, but in Doctor Who they're just background details because the pace of it demands that you blow through those ideas at that pace.
Well, it's a bit like the thing Stephen Moffat came up with in the 90s of the word Doctor coming from the Doctor, like a kind of closed loop, because for Healer and Wise Man, and then he puts that in A Good Man Goes to War. It's not like a big thing; it's just something River Song mentions, and I was like,
throwaway moment, yeah.
Yeah, you've had that in your head for like 20, 25 years, and now you putting it in there. It's not like a big moment, like, "Oh my god, that's where we got Doctor from." It's like, "Oh yeah, we get that from you," and I'm like, "Oh yeah, makes sense." Like it's sort of the same. And I think obviously we can all be quite critical of Doctor Who episodes and stuff, but you've got to think like just the amount of like ideas thrown into them is just crazy, and especially in this early stage, even though this is definitely the series where the Doctor doesn't really go to any alien planets. He goes to like a couple of space stations, I think the same one twice, and mainly to Earth's past and present and stuff, or near future. But it is, as well as being one of the more grounded series, it was quite experimental. They were still kind of learning what the show was and kind of what they could get away with. And yeah, I think Father's Day is a good example of like sort of meshing those ideas to like the really sort of powerful emotional through line. Like the bit where Rose says like, "You're my daddy," or whatever, to Pete, could have been so cringe. That could have been awful, but actually it's really emotional. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like and the score's great in that bit as well. So props to Murray Gold. Like there's just great music and everything.
I think you're right. That moment is on a knife edge of almost being too cheesy, but I think the performances sell it. I think it's not a headline to say Billie Piper is great as Rose, but I think this episode
Heard it here first.
hot take, but but this episode, I think she said it's her favorite of the first series at least, and that's understandable because it really is a showcase for her performance and for Rose, to the extent that the Doctor doesn't really, as you said earlier, he doesn't really feature in the final act, and although it is Pete that saves the day, it's really Rose that's the lead character in this episode.
Definitely. I think, like you say, Rose was kind of she was the co-lead. That was one of the big sort of innovations of Modern Who, was that she was always the co-lead. And so making her kind of slightly more to the forefront in this one totally works. I think it's one of Christopher Eccleston's favourites as well, actually, because he was at a convention last year, I think, and did a reading of it where I think he played Jackie Tyler or something like that with Paul Cornell. So I guess it is kind of one of the actory ones as well, isn't it? Like it's a bit more internal.
And and like I was saying earlier, it's a character piece. It's not plot driven. I like fans will obviously love Bad Wolf, Parting of the Ways, but those plot heavy, monster heavy, CGI heavy episodes probably aren't as much fun for actors to shoot.
No.
Whereas something like this, that's essentially a bunch of people standing around in a room conversing, that's the stuff that I imagine the actors will really enjoy sinking their teeth into.
Yeah, and luckily, sometimes we enjoy watching them too. And they become, favorite episodes.
Before we wrap up, I have another bit of niche trivia that I thought you'd enjoy, though it's not quite as niche as Susan's hat.
Maybe we should make that a permanent section of the podcast, or like a jingle. It's like Morgan's niche trivia.
So you may well know this, but during the scene in Pete's car, where Rose and Pete are in the car together, and music from another era starts to leak into the 1980s, you hear a blast of the 2002 song "Don't Mug Yourself" by The Streets. But Mike Skinner, who is the musician behind The Streets, also makes a cameo in The Time of Angels, the 2010 Doctor Who episode. In the opening scene, he plays a security guard affected by River Song's hallucinogenic lipstick, I think because the director of that episode had previously directed some of The Streets music videos, which means he is surely the only person to have both played a character in Doctor Who and have one of their songs featured in an episode.
Oh, John Barrowman's going to be contacting his lawyers. Like, he's going to be like, "How do I get Anything Goes, the latest album, into the next thing?"
Well, if the rumors about Captain Jack appearing in this year's festive special are true, maybe it'll just end with it. Maybe it'll end with a show tune. It's Christmas. Come on, the normal rules don't apply.
Oh God, that is an image I'm not gonna forget, Harry. Oh, that sounds good. Well, that's a great little piece of trivia to end on.
There you go.
So that was our Father's Day gift to you, all our fathers listening into this. I'm sure there's many of you. Yes, thanks for listening. We have loads more Doctor Who content on radiotimes.com, features, quizzes, and whatnot. So please go and check that out. You can also check out last week's podcast where we talked about the pilot, the 2017 episode. And yeah, we'll be back next week with more Doctor Who fun. But for now, I've been Huw Fullerton.
I've been Morgan Jeffrey.
And goodbye.